Good day, and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And in this episode, we take a deep dive into the wargames-filled world of patent buying and selling. We are joined today by special guest host Louis Carbonneau, founder and CEO of Tangible IP. Mr. Carbonneau is a recognized expert in intellectual property with close to 30 years of professional U.S., Canadian, and international experience in all facets of intellectual property law and business. His firm is the largest brokerage firm in the world and has transacted over 4,500 patents in the past decade. When we sat down with Louis, we hope to be able to provide our listeners with a one-on-one style talk on the ins and outs of patent monetization. What we got was so much more, and so very consistent with our mission of helping our audience see around corners and help their future selves. Louis begins with some excellent historical perspective and an overview of the state of the market, but really drives it all home with a plethora of forward-thinking strategies that make for more robust, defendable, assertable patents. Patents are a long game. The little things you do now can have tremendous impact over the next 15 or more years of your business journey, and it's vital that inventors and practitioners start keeping these strategies in mind if they have any hope of crafting battle-ready, commercial-grade patents. And if you haven't listened to our episode on patent searching, I highly recommend you also give it some ears. In this episode, Louis talks a lot about the importance of searching as it pertains to drafting valuable patents, how it'll help if you get IPR'd, and also help against infringers. It tees in wonderfully with the context and strategy bits Shelley covers in the prior episode, so be sure to check it out. Louis is joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora Consulting, Shelley Couturier, Patent Strategist and Search Specialist here at Aurora, David Jackrell, President of Jackrell Consulting, David Cohen, Principal at Cohen Sciences, Amy Fine, Patent Attorney at Vancott and Adjunct Professor at BYU, and Neil Thompson, Patent Agent at Torrey Pines Law Group. All right, take it away, team.
Does anybody have any tidbits, strategy tidbits, problems, issues, technical issues?
Super quick, because I presented on this months ago, but the after final practice stuff, we ran into this really weird issue where if you, after final rejection, you ask the examiner for an interview and they say, sure, then you have the interview and then you apply for an AFCP 2.0. After that, it was rejected because they said, you've already had an interview. And part of AFCP 2.0 is you're guaranteed an after final interview.
Interesting.
So now what we do, which I just did the other day or yesterday, if we're in that situation, we're going to file an AFCP 2.0. It can be helpful to call the examiner and be like, what, here's our plan. Is it going to be accepted? Do you have any advice for us? Whatever. And then so we call them and we say, hey, if we have an interview first, does that preclude you approving an AFCP 2.0? Because apparently different art units have different rules about this within the patent office, internal rules.
Oh, interesting. So, I think that would be a standardized practice.
I know, right? But I mean, I think it is kind of weird because you're not even like guaranteed and they don't have to give you an interview after your final rejection at all. Right? So then they do, and then you're saying AFCP 2.0, and they're like, really, you want two after final? So I kind of get that, right? I know, right? But anyway, that was a weird little quirk that we were just the first time we ran into it like a few weeks ago.
Oh, interesting. Well, thanks for sharing. It's good to know because some examiners can kind of be sticklers about stuff like that, so it's good to know. Awesome. Anybody else have any issues? People have been using Patent Center recently. I was going to ask everybody briefly about Patent Center, and because we've had increasing issues with EFS Web and us not being able to get PDFs recognized and errors and things like that. Has anybody experiencing similar issues with Patent Center, or is that been a pretty seamless or pretty painless experience?
Yeah, we've been using Patent Center for a while, almost a year. Like right when it sort of became available, we started using it at one of the firms I do a lot of work with, and I like it a lot. I like it much better than EFS.
Really?
I don't use private pair anymore either. I go into Patent Center and I use that. There's like a little search. Once you're logged in Patent Center, you can search any application, and it gives you all the information that private pair gives you. Because private pair for years is just like always hangs up, or you too much traffic, or whatever issue. This application doesn't exist when you know it does. So anyway, I use Patent Center for that a lot too.
Okay. Here, I'll turn it over to Louis.
Okay. Well, good morning or afternoon. So who's on the West Coast? Who's on the East Coast here? Or in the middle? I heard Montana. So
California.
California, Montana.
I think there's 3
Utah.
In Utah, yep.
Utah. Hey.
And then Michigan's right. We do cover most of the time zones. No central time zone, I guess. But we will. Kristen will be joining our team in a couple of weeks, and she'll be central, so we'll have all the time zones covered.
Good. And if I recall, actually from our call, you guys all do, prep and pros work pretty much, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Neil, is that correct for your end as well? Prep and yeah, okay.
Okay.
I'm searching. Shelley's been doing, more and more searching. But yeah, otherwise I think we're all kind of the typical patent agent frame of mind.
Okay. And I'm the guy who's trying to monetize your work product. And it's not easy. I'll tell you why. So just in terms of background, so I don't draft patent myself. So I'm an IP attorney, obviously by profession, but I've dabbled in prep and pros earlier in my career, but I was mostly on the litigation side for several years. And then I joined Microsoft in '95, I think, as a kind of a general counsel for one of their subsidiaries, and then with the mothership in Seattle, where I stayed, until 2009. And there I was in charge of, various groups, in legal and business functions, but in the patent group for most of it, and heading, a lot of the international operations. And then essentially, general manager for our IP licensing business. So that's where I started to, try to learn to monetize, IP and patents. And it was not easy there, and it's still not easy here. It's not easy to do it for a very large corporation, because whenever you approach someone and you say, we have some great patents and great technology, we'd like you guys maybe to explore taking a license on, people here, we want to sue you, if it's Microsoft saying it. So it was pretty hard because of that, whereas, we didn't have those intentions at all. It was really trying to get rid of some of the, non-core technology or some researchy stuff that was not going to be productized, and try to find better conduits for those. So that tells you, even if you have the best of intentions, sometimes by the nature of the assets you're trying to monetize, sometimes it's hard to even engage in a dialogue. But fast forward to today. So basically what I did when I left Microsoft, ended up doing some kind of brokerage on the side for some brokers I had interacted with when I was at Microsoft, and they were having a hard time getting their calls returned from some local aggregator here, Intellectual Ventures, which I'm sure you've all heard about. So I started doing a little bit of that, and then I realized that, okay, there's a market, or at least there was a market back then, in transacting patents. So eventually it became a big part of what we do, and today we probably are the largest patent brokerage firm worldwide, just in terms of being the most active one, and we brokered over 4,500 patents now, whether mostly sale, but sometimes licenses as well, and sometimes both. We close about a deal every month or so. We just announced the sale of a small financial software portfolio yesterday, I believe. And a few weeks ago, we announced the sale of a large portfolio from the Japanese company Seiko, 100-some patents. So those are kind of typical transactions we do. We have a lot of things, obviously, in the fire. So I think what I'd like to do today, and frankly, this is not meant by any way to be kind of a masterclass. It's mostly meant to be interactive. And, every time I have, presentations or discussions with, guys who actually draft patents, I learn a lot more from them than they learn from me. So by all means, please ask questions and make comments. As I said, I'm not in the daily practice of prepping and prosecuting patent, but I do see about 3 to 5 portfolios every single day that people want us to broker. And we broker patents from individual inventors to startups, SMEs, large corporations. We represent, for instance, or have in the recent past, companies such as Google, HP Enterprise, Siemens, Nokia, Honeywell, Carrier, Orange Telecom, WeTransfer. I mean, we represent people all around the world who reach out to us. TikTok, Zoom. We do work for a lot of people, mostly on the sell side, but also on the buy side, helping them acquire patents as well. So there's still a lot of people looking to sell their patents, and there's a few looking to buy them. Not as many, obviously. So there's a market, and there are two things I'd like to talk about briefly. Things that you don't have a lot of control over, which are really the forces, in the market that are essentially making this market better or worse, depending on what the trends are. And then I'll talk more at length about things that you can impact through your work, that make a better work product and easier to sell downstream. So as far as looking at the market in general, it's like any market, it's basically predicated primarily by supply and demand. And there was a time 10 years ago where, you had companies kind of priming the pump. IV, I mentioned intellectual venture was one, basically buying and swooping almost everything that people had and buying a lot of patents that were, forward-looking, not necessarily, being infringed upon. So there was a market that was quite different back then. And you had, kind of I would say, an arms race, to having patents. The case law, the situation was much different back then. If you look back about 10, 12 years ago, you had a lot of demand for patents. As it was considered to be the next kind of commercial weapon. You had mega transactions. If you remember the Nortel deal, where people had a bidding war and paid $4.5 billion for the Nortel portfolio. That was followed, quickly because Google lost that bid. Then they bought Motorola Mobility for something like $10 billion or $12 billion, mostly for their patents, and so forth. That was kind of the golden age or golden era of patent monetization. And unfortunately, that's when I started. So I missed all that. The 5 years before that had been great for anyone who was buying or selling patents. Then after 2012, it came to a screeching halt, essentially. I think people realized that, they were overpaying for assets that, were sometimes not that, clear in terms of what they meant or what they encompassed. And then, the case law changed. We had Bilski and we had Alice, and we're still living with the aftermath of Alice and its progeny. In parallel, we have the AIA, American Advance Act, which really threw monkey wrench in the gears, because suddenly people discovered that IPRs were the new way to invalidate patents, and it kind of took on a life of its own. So all these things contributed to a very different marketplace today than what we had 7, 8, 10 years ago. And as a result, there are a lot of things you have no control on, which impact obviously the liquidity of the market, who's looking to buy. It's very hard for companies to acquire a lot of patents when they're not sure whether they're valid or not. It's as basic as that. Is that try to buy some land if you're not sure that you actually have the right to build something on it. It's and the city can tell you. They'll say, well, build something and we'll tell you if we can issue a permit. But you have to build first. That's a little bit the kind of irony we have with patents. You have to get them first. Pay. I don't know, the average, I think, is $50,000, $60,000, according to the latest surveys I've seen, for a single patent, overall, including maintenance fees and all this, just to get a patent. And then you have to pay another $250,000 for the PTAB to tell you whether it was, it was crap from day one or it was actually valid. Which, if you think about it and you stop for a second, what industry could survive with a business model like this, where you have to buy the thing and then you have to pay 5 times more than you paid for the first time just to be told whether you can use it or not.
Medical industry, you know how well that's working.
With the government, it works great. And the patent office, remember, is the most, profitable, if not the only profitable agency in all the in all the U.S. government. So you can see why. So supply and demand obviously is not what it used to be. There's a lot more people wanting to sell their patents than people wanting to buy. And the people who want to buy are always looking for the perfect patent, which they can't find. For instance, we have 15 portfolios for sale, and we can have access to hundreds of others. And we have 3 clients that have retained us to help them buy a portfolio, and we still haven't found anything they like. Not because there's a lack of portfolios out there, but they just never like what they see. There's always things that they feel, there's a risk there, there's an added risk here, there's some issues with validity or prior art. I mean, people can't seem to find something they like, even though they have the budget and the appetite to buy patents, whereas there's a mountain of patents out there that are waiting to be picked. So we have a big kind of cognitive dissonance between what people want to sell and what people are looking to buy. So there's not a good match, and kind of there's a lot of friction between I would say what the buyers want and what they see on the market. And that's frankly,
your buyers are like, are they typically like larger corporations and your sellers tend to be smaller entities, or is that not
it could be that, but it could be the reverse as well. And we represent Nokia, Siemens, Honeywell, and the buyers might be small entities who want to pad their or bulk up their portfolio inorganically, because it will take a decade to do it organically. It can be another large corporation, although it's fairly rare, that wants to, address maybe a need, because they're going into a new direction and they're kind of naked and they want to have, something quickly, or they want to, they have a cross-patent licensing discussion that's coming up in the next year or two, and they know who it's going to be with, and they want to have something that reads on that company so they can basically, have some leverage in the discussion. Or even we have one client that has retained us and is looking for patents. And it's funny because they have a trademark issue with another company, but they're looking for patents as a way to gain leverage to have a more global discussion with that company and make the trademark issue go away. And since they can't really find anything on the trademark side, because it's a bit hard, they're the ones who came after. Then they're looking into patents to create some kind of leverage to have a discussion and have a some kind of settlement with the other firm. So as many reasons as you have buyers, and obviously you have the whole world of non-practicing entities who are buying patents essentially to monetize, usually through litigation, because licensing is just kind of a obligated detour to say you tried. Well, actually most people don't even try anymore because they know they're not going to get anyone's attention, so they just file a lawsuit first and then sit down to discuss if the other party wants to discuss. So there's I would say there are more buyers these days who are non-practicing entities than operating companies. Mm-hmm. The sellers are usually operating companies. NPs don't really tend to resell the patents they bought. They try to squeeze every ounce of lemon juice they can, with a few exceptions. For instance, we've been retained to represent AST, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with AST. It stands for Allied Security Trust. It is a defensive aggregator, a little bit like an RPX in San Francisco. They have about 45, 50 members. Most of them are Fortune 500 companies. And what they do is they kind of do the clearinghouse for a lot of patent acquisitions / licensing. So there are a lot of companies who will not even review patents. You want to sell them, they'll say, go through AST, they'll do our due diligence, and they'll tell us whether we should look at that. Mm-hmm. And then if there is any appetite with any of the AST member, either to buy or license, then you negotiate with AST on behalf of one or several members. They will either acquire the patents, or we have some kind of an exclusive licensing program with them where we can agree on a price per member per license, and then we will license their members at a certain pre-agreed price, And if 5 members want to take a license, then we'll have 5 licensees, and then the AST just acts as a kind of the master licensee or the licensee sub-licensor, if you will, to their members. So that's a defensive, non-practicing entity, if you will, defensive aggregator, mostly to represent large companies. RPX is a bit the same, although they, frankly, they don't acquire a lot of patents. A lot of people realize it's very expensive to acquire patents, and they prefer to, if it's going to be a defensive play, they much prefer to just license that these days and deal with the risk. They're not going to use these patents against others. They don't really need the assertion value of the patent. They just want to, avoid litigation. So you have a lot of those, buyers/licensees, but it's really hard to approach someone and say, would you like to take a license on these patents? Again, we're a broker. We're not an NPE. We're not a patent troll. We want to have our calls returned. And the reason we have so many large companies who retain us is because we're not perceived as a threat by anyone. And that's important, to maintain that. So for instance, we represent Siemens on a few portfolios, and we have portfolios where we have claim charts that we created that read on Siemens, and that's fine. And we tell our client Siemens, look, we have another portfolio, by the way, we charted you guys on such and such products. Do you want to take a look at it? And they'll say yes, or they'll say no. But they understand that we're not there to sue them. We're actually doing them a favor by showing it to them before it's going to be sold likely to an NP is going to sue them. And sometimes they feel that, they feel emboldened enough to say, well, let's wait to see if they sue and we'll deal with them then. That's kind of, I would say, the MO in most cases. It's just wait and see. Nobody ever got fired for not writing a check to a patent owner, right? So other things so basically supply and demand, obviously case law, we know how hard it is to get, clarity on 101, for instance, and there are a ton of other decisions, in terms of damages, in terms of venue transfer that, play, especially in the litigation world, that have a lot of impact, whether you can sue in Texas or you can sue elsewhere, or stay there at least. And then you have all the usual case law, have to prove validity or not, and treble damages and inducement, and all these things have an impact on I would say, at the end of the day, when you've distilled everything, in terms of what's left with a patent evaluation. Changes in legislation, obviously, like, I don't know if you saw the 2 proposed bills by Senator Leahy earlier this week. Well, you can tell that the big tech, the infringement lobby wrote them. I mean, one is to force patent owners to record their patent. I thought by virtue of having paid the issuance fee, they were recorded with the patent office. And if you assign them, you have to record them. But apparently they want to create another recordation step. And it's called Pride in Ownership or Pride in Patent Act, something like that, which is ridiculous because the whole premise is if you have a patent, you should be proud of it, so you should record it. Otherwise, you won't be allowed, to claim treble damages. So it's such a scam, and you can tell who wrote that. And I don't know if it's going to pass, but it's just I'm flabbergasted by it when I see these things. The second act is even worse. It's basically a very, very surgical act to reverse the current stance from the PTAB on the FinCA rule. So basically, currently, if there is a parallel lawsuit on a patent assertion track, and it's with the district court, and it's moving. Let's say they just didn't file yesterday, but let's say they filed 6 months ago, and there's already some motions, or maybe a markman is scheduled, and sometimes maybe they have a trial date. Well, if there's any kind of progress in the case, and someone files an IPR, currently under that rule, the PTAB will defer and say we won't, institute the petition because there's already a case that is likely to be heard before we're ready, which makes perfect sense. And 2 years ago was the reverse. The courts would stay their case because the PTAB was going faster and there was already an IPR. So it's kind of the reverse, and it makes sense. Whoever is going to be ready first should hear the case. What we're trying to avoid are public duplications. inconsistent decisions where you look at the same patent and the PTAB says it's invalid and the court says it's valid. So that creates chaos and uncertainty. And so there's a bill that's trying to undo that. So obviously, again, you probably know who wrote this. It's got to be the same guys who wrote the other one, because they don't like that rule, because they were having a field day in the PTAB with the 80% invalidation rate. And in the district courts, they don't get that, especially if the cases are in Texas. So these things obviously influence the outcome and in turn influence valuation, because at the end of the day, the price reflects how the market is behaving. It's like a stock market. It goes up and down depending on how these things are, where these arrows are pointing. One thing that's contributing to raise valuation has been the influx of cash, from litigation funding entities. Now it's very easy to find money to finance an assertion campaign against Apple and Samsung and all the big guys who will make you spend $5 million, $10 million in a case. You will find the money if you have a good case. So it's no longer an issue of having to settle very early or just dismiss your case or not start it in the first place because you don't have the money to do it. So as a result, you have seen some decisions with fairly large awards, in the hundreds of millions and even $1 billion. Well, that in turn contributes to attract more cases and it raises valuation. So all these market forces influence essentially, at the end of the day, the value of this asset class. But there's not much you can do about these things. So let's talk about things what you can do. So as I said, we review about 3 to 5 portfolios every day. And I have to say, first, we probably take under brokerage maybe 1 or 2% of what we see. And the reason for that is in many cases, well, first, if there's no infringement, we won't take it under brokerage, just because the only reason why people buy patents these days is for the assertion value. It's like buying accounts receivable. Someone owes you something and you buy it for that reason, either because, you say, if this person comes after me, I have something to throw back, or I'm going to basically monetize this kind of accounts receivable, which is, a non-licensed infringer. If you say, well, they might, like most inventors, when you ask them, is anybody infringing on your patent? They proudly, respond, no, we're so much ahead of the curve. Well, that's too bad. Then we can't sell your patent has no value. You say, what do you mean? I'm ahead of everyone. Well, yeah. So start a business, sell products, but don't expect anyone to buy your patents if nobody's infringing. They don't need it, and then I have to explain to them, if I have the best auto insurance policy with the lowest premium and the best coverage, and I'm trying to sell this, and you say, Louis, it's great, but I don't own a car. It's the same thing with patents. If they don't need it, whether it's irrelevant whether it's the greatest invention since sliced bread, So just think of it from their standpoint. They don't need this. They don't need to practice these right. If they do 2 years from now, be sure, either they'll take a chance and they'll do it, which most people do, or they'll knock at your door then. But there's no reason for them to write you a check now for something they might only need 2, 3, 5 years, or maybe never. So that's
where there's. What about situations where there's, like you said, like companies trying to just kind of get rid of, like I know an individual actually in town here who does a lot of this for Stryker, where he basically has a very significant pulse on their IP, not even just patents and stuff like that, but also just their know-how, their, technical specs and things like that. And his whole role with Stryker is to move IP out of the company, either in licensing or selling. And so I can imagine in some cases, it's like kind of like you said with Microsoft, they have this little pet project that they never took anywhere. And in that case, nobody may be infringing it, but it may be of value to another company.
You're totally right, Ashley. But that's not selling patents. That's just licensing technology. This is pure technology transfer, what you're describing. It's a totally different universe. And I've done a lot of that, Then you have some orphan technology that you're not using, bundle with know-how, with, trade secrets, patents, sometimes even trademark. But, usually it's going to be some technology that represents years of R&D, sunken investment, millions of dollars, millions of lines of code or whatever the technology is, a ton of know-how. And you say, okay, this is enabling. I can basically sell this or license this to someone and help them get, hit the ground running. And in that context, the patents really only come for the ride. They're not the main factor. They're not the driving factor behind the transaction. Because, without the know-how, without the underlying technology, frankly, there's not much you can do. These patents will not teach you how to do that. So we're talking about, the sale or license of naked patents versus technology transfer, where there might be patents that come for the ride, but they're not really the driving factor. But it's a good point because, some people sometimes, say, how come, some people have, that company X has sold 100 patents to company Y. Well, you have to look at the deal. It was really not a sale of patent. It was a technology transfer deal where, they had to obviously transfer the underlying IP to that other company. But believe me, without the underlying technology, there would have been no deal.
Yeah.
There will always be exception. You might have, we sold one large portfolio a few years back to a Chinese company in the automotive space because, they were only in China. They wanted to go global and they were totally vulnerable with no patents outside of China. And we had a great portfolio that was a great fit for them. And they bought it and there was no claim charge. Nobody was infringing. It was kind of getting close, but this was mostly a kind of forward-looking play in their case. And they've stopped doing that, so because we had a similar situation and we said, no, we don't do that anymore. We only buy patents if, we have immediate needs. So even they have kind of, backtrack a little bit on what they did. But it's fairly rare that you'll see that. Then again, it's a very different animal. There are companies who have full licensing teams trying to do that. And then you have the large corporations that are, essentially licensing their set patents and kind of assertion stick licensing way where there's no other really technology, but it's really, standard essential patents, which is also kind of a third pillar, separate silo and very different business. And you have the likes of, Ericsson, Nokia, and others who do that for a living. And in that case, they're really, essentially doing patent pooling and making sure that people pay their fair share for practicing a standard that they participated into.
Okay, I was going to ask about you take about 1 or 2% of the portfolios you review. So other than the question of infringement, what are the other main things? You're rejecting, right? You want to reject. It's mainly a question of dismissing and what remains then is interesting.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So no, I was going to come to that. Thank you, David. Basically, the first thing I look at is, okay, is there any potential infringement? I know if there's none, it's going to be really, really hard to sell unless there's 500 patents. So I'm not saying that's the only thing I look at, but that's one of the first things. The second thing, obviously, is, is there only one patent or do we have a portfolio? Because if there's only one patent, it's really, really hard to monetize these one season, 2 season. People are not interested, especially if there's no open continuation. And that's where you guys can make a big difference in your practice. If in the US, always leave an open continuation. Always, always. Even if it's your 8, 9, 10 patent in the same family, just put a placeholder, file a continuation. Forget to send some materials, wink, wink, not, by 6 months before you get, a missing material request, whatever. Apparently there are little tricks of the trade there to buy time, but buy time, keep the family open, because the case law changes all the time, as you know, and it's a lot easier to go back and change claims when you have an open continuation than trying to file a re-exam. If you have an IPR and someone files a bunch of prior art in your IPR file, you can go back and take all the prior art and then put this in the prosecution of a continuation and get a bulletproof patent. You can do, if there's a new case law, like an Alice case, or like what happened 10 years ago when suddenly the means plus functions claims were out of favor and you have an open continuation, well, guess what? You can just go back and change your claims. You don't have to do anything acrobatic to try to salvage the portfolio. So that's the very first unforced error that most people do. And frankly, if you don't do that, if you don't at least recommend to your client to file a continuation, for me, it's almost malpracticing. because you're really putting your client at a disadvantage. Another thing we see all the time, and again, you can have a big impact on that, is the lack of prior art search. There are still people who operate in the 90s where you would say to your client, don't pay anything to the prior art search. This is the examiner's job. They'll do it for free, And then you get a patent issued, and guess what? You say, look, I told you. There's a big, and I'm hard sometimes on the patent bar because I think, the interests are not really well aligned. What the client wants in most cases is a patent that will be meaningful for their business. What the patent agents and patent attorneys have as a deliverable, as a metric, is to get a patent issued. And as you all know, a patent can issue, almost any patent will issue if you narrow the claim enough so that it becomes meaningless. You'll get an issuance. And if all the client wants is something to frame and put in their wall, that may be fine. But I guess that's really not what most of them are looking for here. And if you essentially give them a result, which is an issued patent, and they think they have something of value that will support their business when they need to enforce, and 5-10 years later, when they finally need to enforce it, they realize that all their business was built on a house of cards because the foundation is like quicksand. The minute they want to enforce, they're being told their patent is invalid because there was a ton of prior art that should have been discovered during prosecution and was not. Then you didn't really do them any favor. So by all means, go ahead.
How do you balance? Because I think some of the balance is always interesting with searching, right? Because I feel like you could search a few hours and find some stuff, but you could also spend, days searching and never scour everything, right? Somebody who's a better searcher, different database, different country, different translation, whatever, could find something. So where do you have a feeling for what that balance is of searching and finding versus scouring, on the one balance and not searching?
Yeah. Well, first, a lot of people don't search at all. I mean, you can see when a patent has been issued, you look at the prior art cited, and you see a little asterisk in front of every single patent. That means there was no prior art search done, and they relied completely on the examiner to do it. And as you probably know, although the typical prosecution may take 2 to 3 years, on average, a U.S. examiner will spend no more than 3 hours looking for prior art, and they essentially search the U.S. database. So it's a completely inadequate search, and no wonder why so many patents are invalidated after they've been issued. I mean, you look at them and you say, "Come on!" I mean, there's got to be something else, and you look for 3 hours and you find 4 pieces of prior art that are relevant. I mean, it's not rocket science. The main problem is not doing it at all. As far as the balance is concerned, what you've described, Ashley, I think there's the good prior art search, and most firms will do that, and we do a lot of those too, or patentability assessment, for a fixed price, and they'll look through the main databases and they'll look through non-patent literature, and you can pretty much cover 90% of the ground for less than $2,000, essentially. And then you have the litigation kind of search where you're being sued, and then you're going to basically spend, whatever needs to be spent until you find something, because it can make the difference between losing and winning and having a big, award to pay or having an invalid patent. So
I can say when I was at the search firm, that's exactly how it played out. It depended on the case. When Intellectual Ventures was at their height, we would search for them anywhere from 15 to 25 hours, finding infringers and validating patents, trying to invalidate patents.
Yeah. And I think that's reasonable. And, there's so many firms who do that. There's so much competition there, and the tools are great. You can get this kind of effort, 15, 25 hours for, again, less than $2,000 for a client. If you look again at the price of a bad patent, which is the same than the price of a good patent, which is about $50,000, $60,000, it's a drop in the bucket. And not only that, I tell my clients, if you do a patentability assessment and we find all the prior art, and you've written a good disclosure, invention disclosure before that allows us to do the search, and you bring that to your patent attorney, you're probably going to recoup those costs because they won't have to conduct a bunch of interviews to understand what it is about. They'll have the product right in front of them. You draft much better patents when you know what the examiner is going to have, and you can preempt some of the arguments in the way you draft and the way you craft not only your spec, but your claims, obviously. So it makes for a more robust patent, more likely to be issued, less likely to be challenged successfully, and it costs overall probably $1,500, $2,000, some of which you'll recoup because you'll probably have a less expensive prosecution than drafting because you provided more information to your patent attorney. So I frankly see no reason why not do that. But again, if the answer is you don't have an invention, you're right, it already exists. This is really that's the issue. Is this is not a good business model for you guys to tell the client, this is crap. You don't need to file a patent on that, it already exists, or that invention is going to be so incremental, that the claims will be so narrow by the time it issues 3 years from now, the technology will have evolved and will have leaped, way forward, your tiny invention. So don't waste your money on me. So nobody wants to say that, but frankly, that would be the honest answer in many cases. When you look at a product, don't spend your money on this, it already exists, or it's so incremental that it's not worth it. And the day people do that, you're going to have a lot less patents that are invalidated because they were, essentially they weren't valid in the first place. And believe me, I see a lot of those. I mean, I'm not joking. We see so much volume. I can tell you, it's not just bad patent attorneys. It's just the business incentives are misaligned, and that's what's creating a lot of these patents to be issued because your metric is not the same as the client, but the client doesn't know it. The client thinks that you have the same metric and the same goal, and you don't actually. Well, only
so
parts.
You have that argument with law firms, I would imagine, right? I mean, this sounds like a point of contention. Yeah.
Well, point of contention. I mean, they send me a lot of stuff. I just look at the work product and say, guys, you didn't do your job here. Because we will do some prior art search and we'll find something and we'll tell the client, look, we can't take this under brokerage because you didn't invent anything. You should have done a prior art search prior to filing, and you would have saved yourself, especially when there's a portfolio with 5 to 10 patents, you would have saved yourself $500,000 probably in fees, if you had only spent $2,000 in search originally. So again, I love patent. I mean, I'm part of the patent part, but I just don't like the fact that the business incentives are not properly aligned with what the client needs to get a meaningful patent at the end. And it reflects in the marketplace today, because, we can say all the bad things we want to say about the PTAB, about it being biased and all this, but the reality is, in a lot of cases, there was some relevant prior art, that made some of these patents invalid, the way they were drafted. And again, if you have an open continuation, then you can maybe salvage it. If you don't, and it's past, well, you can always file a re-exam, but that's another, another battle.
So let me one more thing. So with regard to the 1 or 2% that you like,
yeah,
you do further analysis, I would imagine, depending on how much the seller gives you to begin with. So do you share all that with the potential buyer? That's the question. Do you share your full view
with a potential buyer?
Yeah, for the buyer.
But it depends. I mean, what we do is, when we do triage, again, there are some that we can reject very quickly. Sometimes we'll reject them because, the expectations are just unrealistic. The guy has one provisional patent and he wants $1 billion for it, so those are quickies, you're not going to get anywhere. So again, we require at least 2 issued patents because we know that just one single patent is almost impossible to transact. We're looking for something that's infringed. We want to have obviously as much prior art cited as possible. We want to have claims that are enforceable, and that's something I should just say, a few words on. A lot of the claims we look at are not enforceable. And again, that's on you guys. A lot of divided infringement issues. People sometimes, when they draft patents, they don't think about who's going to be the infringer. And you have to have that in mind. We have so many patents where we look at the claim and say, look, there's going to be two agents, it's like solar panel patents, if it's infringed by the installer, it's not going to do me any good. I need something that's infringed by the manufacturer here. The installers are all mom and pops, and you're not going to start suing the guy who does a few solar panel installs, every month. So you can see that in the cloud space. You can see that in any kind of server network where you have the server, the cloud. Sometimes it's just a matter of redrafting the claim so that everything happens at the server level. But, a lot of things we look at, it was done maybe too hastily, but, you have clear divided infringement issues. And again, there's not much you can do about Alice and the case law, but there's a lot you can do about drafting claims that won't have these issues. Indefiniteness, lack of support in the specs. I mean, we see it all the time, frankly. And again, this is all about the drafter. This is not about the invention itself. It's about how you draft claim, making sure you have your support, antecedent, you have no indefiniteness, no divided infringement. I mean, just these three things that I've mentioned, probably disqualify, 30-40% of the patent we look at. So you can do a lot of goodness by thinking, okay, who's the potential infringer or the potential infringers, and make sure we draft some claims that encapsulate each of them in a way that is whole, and will not create these divided infringement issues. The lack of support, as I said, is very common. These cascading CIPs drive me nuts. We're trying to sell a portfolio with 44 patents, and they're all CIPs of one another. Do you think anyone in his right mind or her right mind is going to take the time to look at 43 specs and try to distill the new subject matter that was inserted in each of one, and then compare the claim, and then trying to basically decipher, okay, if that word is there and it first appeared in that CIP, that means that for this kind of scenario, my priority date suddenly is 3 years later. Hence, I have to look at intervening prior art. And I mean, forget it. Nobody's going to do that. So stop this CIP nonsense. I mean, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. First, you lose a lot of patent term, and it might look trivial when you file a patent that's going to be good for 20 years. But the reality is most patents that are transacted are in their last 5-6 years of shelf life. So most of the patents we take on the brokers have between, I would say, 12 and 18 years already passed. So which means that sometimes they have less than 2 years left. Sometimes they have 6 months left in their term. So if you file a CIP and for some reason the actual filing date for those claims is 3 or 4 years later than the parent one, you didn't do yourself any favor or your client any favor, because suddenly that patent is about to expire or may have just expired. And that was the one with the good claims. Because we all know the first patent you're going to get is not the one where you're going to fall in love with the claims. There's going to be maybe the third or fourth continuation. But try to stay away from CIPs, because they do more, I can tell you, they do more damage than anything else. I haven't seen anyone in terms of buyers or litigators that like them. So I have to defer to them on that. And I can see when we have too many CIPs, people say, look, it's like spaghetti code. I'm not going to get into this. It's too complicated, the lineage. And obviously sometimes you don't have any choice but to file a CIP. And sometimes if you do it carefully, you will be able to make sure you have sufficient support and you're just adding some data. So again, don't take this as gospel, but for the most part, I've seen a lot more disadvantages, of people filing CIPs than not. You're better with, just filing, pretty large omnibus patent and then doing a bunch of divisionals, in my experience. And regular continuations to keep the families open. So that's one thing where you can help. We see a lot of unnecessary restrictions where people just say, if we just add this restriction, the examiner is going to be happy and issue the patent, instead of fighting the good fight. The people surrender too early sometimes and too easily. And as a result, you end up with unnecessary restrictions in your claims or limitations in your claims that when you're trying to enforce are the ones that are not on the corresponding product. And then you're kind of stuck. So it's okay to add limitations in dependent claims, but please don't do that in your independent claims just to satisfy the examiner instead of, pushing back when you think you should. It's better.
As I said, there is a little bit of a balance too, because what I sometimes see, and it frustrates me, is that you have firms that try to push for these broad claims, especially at the outset, when the searching has been done, you have all the literature, and there's just no way in hell that somebody's going to get those claims. But then you have these firms that say, will push for this like really broad method. I feel like I see it a lot in method of treatment where they're like push for this broad method of treatment claim. And it just, I feel like that's also setting somebody up for failure too, to go in there with this crazy broad claim to try to, kind of almost squeak one by an examiner who maybe is not reading things as closely or not paying attention as closely. So I feel like the overly broad can be just as detrimental as the overly narrow.
Yeah, no, you don't want to be overly broad, especially with Alice. You're going to get into Alice territory very quickly. I think what I'm saying is very often I will see in prosecution someone who will just cave into the examiner by adding a limitation in the claim that didn't need to be there. And that's going to basically backfire later on, because those are the ones that very often will not be on the infringing product and will make a difference between an infringed claim or not. So just sometimes be careful not to cave in too early, thinking that that's just a minor thing. Especially if it's going to be in your independent claim, then it's going to follow the whole claim set. So sometimes we prefer, personally, I much prefer to see some scar tissue in prosecution than something that just kind of went by so smoothly that at the end of the day you say, well, the examiner didn't really do his or her job then, because their job is to push back and make you earn that patent. And if you see just one non-final rejection and then they allow your claim set without asking too much, it's almost suspicious for me. I like to see a few rejection letters and some good fight, some scar tissue where you didn't make some concession, but you basically overcame this. Because when you get into PTAB mode, if there's an IPR, you can have the same battle to fight, and if it's already been fought with the examiner, you have a lot more leverage, and the PTAB is asked to second guess the examiner, which they don't like to do as much as when it's silent. When it's silent, it's almost like an appeal de novo. They say, well, the examiner didn't have this prior art, or this argument wasn't presented, so we don't know how he or she would have thought about it, and so we'll just substitute our own thinking. If it's already there and there's been some good argument, it's going to help you. For instance, we have a portfolio currently that's being litigated, and there was during prosecution, and it's over a little swing set, those swing set that kind of move vertically instead of swinging more traditionally. And great invention from our guy and all this. And during prosecution, the examiner just, didn't seem to understand the difference in all this, or didn't want to see it. And our guy had to go through an appeal, filed an appeal, went to the PTAB as an appeal, not as a IPR. And he won. And then, he got the claim he wanted. Then he fought the good fight and won. And I have to tell you, it made a huge difference in the case, because we had the Markman a few months ago. And because of that, we're able to convince the judge that, this had already been kind of litigated, and the claim construction was clear. And that's what it meant. And we had won that battle already. And the judge was deferential to the fact that there was an appeal and that we fought for this. They didn't want to go with the other side's construction, which was basically relitigating the appeal, during prosecution. So again, it's always think that the little things you do or don't do now will have an impact maybe only 15 years from now, but it will. And you've got to do it right. So all these things you can really help, as I said, prior art searches, the claim drafting, open continuation, support in the spec. Try not to do the CIP route if you can. Foreign corresponding patents help as well. So we always prefer to see a portfolio that has some, EPO filings or Chinese filings, mostly because since eBay, we've had to export the injunction, leverage to other countries. You have to go in countries that will grant you an injunction, and currently mostly it's Germany and China. So if you file a German and a Chinese counterpart, you're giving your client, and again, 5 years, 10 years from now, will it be other countries? Probably, but there's so much you can guess. But currently, I can tell you, if I have a portfolio that's infringed by a phone manufacturer or a multinational company that has activities elsewhere in the world, and I have an infringed German counterpart or an infringed Chinese counterpart, I can do a lot more damage, and I have a ton more leverage to negotiate a license or a settlement with the infringer than if I only have a U.S. patent. I may not even have to sue in the U.S. I may only have to sue in China or in Germany and tell the guy, obviously, we have a U.S. patent. We're going to sue in the U.S. for damages if we don't settle. But for now, we can get an injunction in Germany or in China that can disrupt your supply chain. So why don't we have a conversation? And that's how this game is played. So you have to understand that these are strategic weapons.
If anybody has any questions or comments?
I like the word scar tissue. I'm going to add that to my vocabulary.
It's good scar tissue. When you work in the field, you get a lot of calluses, and the skin is much thicker. That's the same thing with a patent. You want something like this. Sometimes an inventor will say, we didn't even have a non-rejection letter. It just flew. I had my claims allowed initially, didn't have to fight for it, and they're so happy. And I have to break the news that this is actually not very positive.
Not good.
These are the things where, again, it's okay to fight back with the examiner, and interviews are great. I think everybody who practices interviews usually have better results than people who don't. So there's no reason not to do that. And you can get a lot of good business intelligence. And sometimes, they're human beings. It's not that they don't want you to have the patent for your client. If you convince them that this word is better than that word, or is the same scope as far as they're concerned, but for you, strategically that it's going to, keep some options open. It's okay to fight for that because it's going to make a big difference. And again, the deliverable that you give the client should not be, I just got your patent issued, because for me, it's meaningless. It's like, I've got your painting frame. Yeah, but is the painting any good? You really have to think about, is this an enforceable patent that they will be able to rely on and assert and maintain the validity thereof when they need it, whether it's 2 years or 15 years from now? Or if they want to sell it, will they get anything out of it because it's commercial grade, as opposed to something that's so narrow that it only really covers a clone of their product. And that's maybe the last thing I'd like to say, in adding, including on my end, is a lot of patents are really drafted to cover the invention, which is really not what you should be doing. You should be really thinking of the design around and then invent around that design around and file some claims to cover that, because nobody is going to clone you. Except for a few Chinese knockoff, nobody's going to clone perfectly what your client is doing. In all cases that I've seen, frankly, the initial infringement is innocent. Innocent. You don't have anyone who knew about your client's patent when they designed their feature. They just designed something that came to them naturally, especially in the software world. And then it just so happens it might read on your client's patent. So if your patent was really narrow to cover their invention, there's a very good chance it will not be enough to secure any kind of infringement story on that, because there will be too many limitations. So again, think about playing the bad guys. What will your competitors do? And the clients love that when you explain to them. It's kind of role playing, right? You say, now pretend you're the bad guy, and try to break that patent or try to go around. What would you do? How would you do it? Okay, what are the pros and cons? And let's file some claims around that and enrich the patent. So it can be more of a kind of a war game simulation than just drafting something and say, look at this and tell me if you agree. So again, you want to have something that's going to be meaningful down the road. You just don't know when you're going to need it, but it's not a reason not to do a good job about it, so that, when it happens, if and when it happens, you've got something that is, ready for battle.
Certainly makes patent law more fun when it's war games.
Okay, that's all I had to say.
Awesome. We really appreciate it, Louis. Thank you so much for kind of the historical perspective, and then also, some practical tips, because I think, in this, the whole spirit of this group is to up our game per se. And so I think, I know there's some tidbits I've been taking down the side too about just different ways to think about things. And so I hope everybody else had some tidbits, or if you have any additional questions, there's a few more minutes to throw them out there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Gave us a lot to think about.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
enjoy
It was a pleasure interacting with you guys. Best of luck. And again, I love patent lawyers. It's just that, I'm trying to help them get a better work product at the end.
it.
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take
Have a
care.
good day.
Hopefully-
Bye.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at aurorapatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion, or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.